There is a moment, and if you have loved someone who runs from closeness, you know exactly the kind of moment being described here, where everything you thought you understood about them stops making sense. You did everything right. You gave them space. You didn't push. You stayed calm when they went cold. You swallowed your needs like they were something to be ashamed of. And still, they pulled back. Still, they disappeared into themselves like a door closing slowly in your face. And the worst part, you're not even angry. You're just confused. Because somewhere underneath all of that distance, you felt something real. You know you did. And the question that keeps you up at night isn't whether they care. It's why that caring never seems to be enough to make them stay. That question is exactly what this is about. Not how to chase them, not how to convince them, but what actually happens inside an avoidant, psychologically, emotionally, at the level of their nervous system, that finally breaks through the wall they've built between what they feel and what they're willing to show you. To understand what forces an avoidant into contact with their real feelings, you first have to understand what they've been doing this entire time. Because the distance wasn't indifference. That's the painful irony that most people in this situation never fully get to see. Avoidant attachment doesn't develop because someone didn't care enough. It develops because someone cared too much in an environment where caring was dangerous. As a child, emotional expression didn't get them comfort. It got them dismissed, overwhelmed, ridiculed, or simply ignored by caregivers who weren't equipped to hold big emotions. So the nervous system did what nervous systems do. It adapted. It learned that emotions, especially tender ones, were liabilities, that needing someone was the fastest road to disappointment, that the only safe way to love was to do it quietly, internally, at a distance where the other person couldn't see it and therefore couldn't use it against them. By the time they become an adult, this isn't a conscious strategy anymore. It's neurological. It's wired in. When intimacy gets too close, the brain doesn't register it as warmth. It registers it as threat. The same closeness that you're offering as love, their body is processing as danger, and so they retreat. Not because they want to leave, but because everything in their biology is screaming at them to protect themselves from the thing they actually want most. This is not an excuse. It's a map, because if you want to understand what finally forces them through that wall, you have to understand what the wall is made of. The wall is made of suppression, chronic, habitual, deeply unconscious suppression. Avoidants don't process emotions the way most people do. Research into attachment styles has consistently shown that avoidants don't experience fewer emotions. They experience just as many, sometimes more intensely. What they do differently is reroute them. The emotion rises, and before it ever reaches consciousness in a way that demands expression, the brain intercepts it, files it away, buries it under logic, under tasks, under the comfortable numbness of keeping busy. They become, over years of practice, extraordinarily skilled at not knowing what they feel. But suppression is not the same as elimination. The feelings don't disappear. They accumulate. They sit in the body like pressure in a sealed container, and no matter how reinforced the walls of that container are, physics always wins eventually. What forces an avoidant to get in touch with their real feelings for you is, at its core, the failure of suppression. And that failure can be triggered in ways that are more predictable than you might think. One of the most significant triggers is loss. Not the threat of loss, actual loss. The difference is enormous, and it's one of the cruelest dynamics in avoidant psychology. When you're present, when you're available, consistent, still visibly hoping, the avoidant brain can afford to keep suppressing. You're not going anywhere. There's no urgency. The feelings can stay filed away because nothing is forcing them to be examined. Your availability is, paradoxically, part of what allows them to continue not feeling. But when you leave, when you genuinely stop pursuing, when your presence in their life becomes uncertain or absent, something shifts in the neurological landscape. The brain, which has been quietly registering your significance all along, even while consciously minimizing it, suddenly has to reckon with the possibility that it calculated wrong, that it dismissed something that mattered, that the emotional distance it maintained to stay safe has cost it something it actually valued. This is when the suppression starts to crack, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a fracture in a dam, slow at first, then increasingly impossible to hold back. They start to think about you in ways they didn't allow themselves to before. The mind drifts toward memories that were always there, but never examined. A specific thing you said, the way you understood something about them that no one else ever tried to understand, the texture of being around you. These thoughts arrive unbidden, and because they're no longer defending against your presence, the defenses against the feelings themselves begin to weaken. You deserve to hear this clearly, because it is something that the confusion of loving an avoidant can make you doubt entirely. The fact that they suppressed their feelings was never evidence that the feelings weren't there. Suppression requires something to suppress. The architecture they built to keep their emotions contained was, in its own way, a testament to how much there was to contain. The grief that surfaces when an avoidant loses someone they genuinely connected with is often described in therapy as disproportionate, meaning it surprises even the avoidant themselves, because they had convinced themselves they were fine. They had constructed an entire internal narrative around not needing, not wanting, not being affected. And then absence punches a hole through all of it, and what pours out is everything they spent months or years refusing to acknowledge. That is not manipulation. That is not a tactic designed to pull you back in. It is the authentic experience of a nervous system that has been running interference on its own emotional life for so long that it forgot there was anything behind the interference. Grief alone, though, doesn't always complete the journey, because grief can be suppressed too. Avoidants are capable of grieving without ever letting the grief mean anything, without letting it connect back to what it's actually about. They can feel the ache of your absence and still intellectualize it away. Tell themselves it's temporary. Tell themselves they're better off. Tell themselves it proves their original instinct was right, that closeness leads to pain and distance is the only protection. What breaks through that secondary layer of defense is something more nuanced. It's self-confrontation. There are moments, usually quiet ones, usually solitary ones, where the avoidant finds themselves unable to maintain the story they've been telling about why things ended or why they pulled away. The story usually positions them as reasonable, and the relationship as too complicated, too demanding, too intense. This story is not malicious. It's protective. It allows them to keep their sense of self intact while also avoiding the emotional reckoning that genuine vulnerability would require. But stories have weak points, and when the avoidant is alone with the actual texture of their experience, not the narrative but the raw feeling, inconsistencies begin to appear. They remember a moment where you were patient with them, and the story says the relationship was too demanding. The two things can't coexist. They remember feeling genuinely safe with you, and the story says intimacy is dangerous. Again, the logic breaks down. The story cracks, and in that crack, the real feeling starts to emerge. Not the managed, processed, intellectualized version, but the actual feeling, the one that was always there. This is where their relationship with identity becomes critical to understand. Avoidants have often built an entire sense of self around not needing people. Independence is not just a behavior for them. It is a core identity. The belief that they are fundamentally self-sufficient, fundamentally okay alone, fundamentally different from people who need connection, is not just a coping strategy. It is how they understand themselves. It is the bedrock of their self-concept. When someone challenges that identity, not aggressively, not by demanding they be different, but simply by being someone whose absence genuinely matters, it creates what psychologists describe as cognitive dissonance. The belief system and the lived experience no longer match. The person tells themselves they don't need anyone, and then they reach for their phone hoping there's a message. The person tells themselves they're better off with space, and then they find themselves sitting in that space feeling an emptiness they can't explain away. Cognitive dissonance is psychologically uncomfortable, not theoretically, physically. It creates actual internal tension that the mind is motivated to resolve. And the two ways to resolve it are to change the behavior or to change the belief. Changing the belief that they don't need connection, that they were fine, that the relationship wasn't as meaningful as it felt, is enormously threatening for an avoidant. It requires dismantling something load-bearing in their psychology. But it is also, eventually, what happens, slowly, incompletely sometimes. But it happens. There is another force that operates alongside loss and self-confrontation, and it is perhaps the most quietly powerful of all. It's called the protest cycle, and it tends to run underground in avoidance in a way that even they don't consciously recognize. The protest cycle is the emotional response to perceived abandonment. Here's the painful irony. Avoidants, who are often accused of being emotionally unavailable, are often deeply protest-prone when the person they've been distancing from actually leaves. Because as long as you were present, the attachment system was quiet. There was no threat. The avoidant could maintain their distance and keep the relationship in a kind of emotional holding pattern. You were available, they were safe, and they didn't have to feel the depth of what they felt because there was no urgency. But when the relationship ends or when you stop engaging, the attachment system activates, the same system that gets triggered in anxious attachment, the one that screams that something important is at risk. It fires. And suddenly the avoidant, who spent so long convincing themselves they were comfortable with distance, is experiencing the very feelings they constructed their entire personality to avoid. I miss you in a way that doesn't feel like missing. It feels like restlessness, like an ambient dissatisfaction with everything else, like an inability to be fully present in their own life. They don't always recognize it as longing. They're not practiced at labeling it that way, but it lives in them as a low hum of something unfinished, something wrong. Some avoidants, especially those with more secure inclinations mixed into their style, will eventually sit with that hum long enough to recognize what it is. And recognizing it, even privately, even without acting on it, represents a fundamental shift. Because naming the feeling is the opposite of suppressing it. It's the first moment in which the wall between what they feel and what they know they feel becomes actually permeable. For others, this process only happens in therapy, or in the painful retrospect of realizing that a pattern has repeated across multiple relationships and always ends the same way. The self-awareness comes slower, but it comes. What you need to understand, what matters most for you specifically, is that this process is not something you can accelerate from the outside. You cannot chase them into self-confrontation. You cannot argue them into recognizing their feelings. You cannot be available enough to replace the thing that absence does, nor can you perform weaving in a way that manufactures the experience authentically. Authenticity is the operative word here. The avoidance nervous system is extraordinarily sensitive to what's real versus what's performed, because their entire early experience was one of learning to read emotional authenticity as a survival skill. What you can do, and this matters more than you might currently be able to feel, is be genuinely okay without them. Not as a strategy, not as a tactic designed to trigger their protest cycle, but as an actual orientation toward your own life that makes you psychologically free, regardless of what they choose. And that is not a manipulation. That is, in fact, the only real freedom available to you in this dynamic. Let's go deeper into what actually happens neurologically in the moments before an avoidant allows themselves to feel. The brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, has been conditioned, in avoidance, to associate emotional vulnerability with danger. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical wiring that happened during formative years, when intimacy was met with punishment, inconsistency, or dismissal in childhood. The brain encoded those experiences as warnings. Vulnerability became correlated with threat. The body learned to produce a stress response in anticipation of emotional exposure. This is why avoidants often describe feeling suffocated in relationships, even when the other person has done nothing suffocating. The feeling is being generated internally, not by the actual situation. The nervous system is reacting to intimacy the way it learned to react to danger, with the same cortisol, the same urge to flee, the same narrowing of perception that happens in actual threat states. Healing, for an avoidant, requires what's called neurological reconditioning, which is a clinical way of saying that the brain has to have enough experiences of vulnerability being safe before it starts to stop treating it as a threat. This is gradual. It often requires a therapeutic relationship, though not always. Sometimes it happens through repeated patient experience with a genuinely secure partner. Sometimes it happens through solitary periods of reflection following loss. But here is the thing about reconditioning. It requires the stimulus. You cannot recondition a fear response by permanently avoiding the thing that triggers it. Avoidance reduces short-term anxiety, but strengthens long-term fear. Every time the avoidant distances themselves from intimacy, they reinforce the neurological pathway that says intimacy is dangerous. Every time they stay, even briefly, even imperfectly, they begin to build an alternative pathway. This is why, for some avoidants, the person who finally gets through is not the person who was most patient. It's the person they were the most afraid of, the one whose significance they could not manage down to comfortable size, the one who somehow, despite all the distancing, remained real to them. There is a psychological concept known as approach-avoidance conflict. It describes the internal experience of being simultaneously drawn toward and repelled by the same thing. For avoidance in relationships, this is the constant internal state. They want closeness, and they fear closeness. They're drawn to the person and threatened by how much they're drawn to them. The desire and the defense are operating at the same time, pulling in opposite directions. What feels like hot and cold behavior, the reaching out followed by disappearing, the warmth followed by sudden distance, is the outward expression of that internal conflict. It isn't cruelty. It isn't games. It is a person who genuinely doesn't know how to reconcile what they want with what their nervous system is telling them is safe. The resolution of that conflict, when it happens, tends to come from the approach side winning, not because the fear disappears, but because the pull becomes stronger than the fear. This typically requires two things: a prolonged absence that increases the pull, and enough personal growth or self-awareness that the fear begins to be recognized for what it is, rather than taken at face value. Personal growth in an avoidant is rarely motivated by discomfort alone. Discomfort they are expert at managing. What tends to motivate growth is the recognition of a pattern. The second or third time a meaningful relationship ends the same way, with them having withdrawn, with the other person having left, with the same empty silence in the aftermath. Something cognitive shifts. The mind, which had been attributing relational outcomes to the situation, begins to suspect the self. That shift in attribution is seismic for an avoidant, because as long as the problem was external, the relationship was too demanding, the timing was wrong, the other person wanted too much, the self was intact. Safe, not the source of the issue. But when the pattern becomes undeniable, the attribution has to move inward. And moving inward is exactly the direction avoidants spend most of their emotional lives avoiding. When it happens, though, when the avoidant genuinely turns toward themselves and asks what they are actually afraid of, what they are actually protecting, what they have actually lost, the answer is almost never as terrifying as the avoiding made it seem. The feelings that pour out are not overwhelming in the way the nervous system promised they would be. They are simply human: grief, longing, the desire to be known by someone, the fear of being truly seen and found to be inadequate. These are not extraordinary feelings. They are the most ordinary feelings in the world. But for the avoidant, encountering them for the first time in a genuinely felt way, rather than an intellectually acknowledged way, can be genuinely transformative. Here is where it gets complicated. And you need to hear this because it's the part that most people in your position don't anticipate. When an avoidant finally gets in touch with their real feelings, when the wall comes down, even partially, even temporarily, their first response is rarely to come to you. Their first response is almost always internal. It's private. It's the quiet, often tearful, often physically uncomfortable experience of feeling something they have been numbing for a very long time. They might sit with this for days, weeks, without telling anyone, without acting on it, because even when the emotional suppression breaks, the behavioral inhibition often remains. They know how to feel alone. They don't yet know how to feel in the direction of another person. Moving from private emotional experience to relational expression requires a second act of courage that the first act doesn't automatically supply. Some avoidants move through this stage and reach out. Some circle back repeatedly without ever quite completing the circuit. And some, particularly those who haven't done any internal work, who haven't recognized the pattern, who are still in the early stages of what will likely be a long journey, feel the feelings and then, almost immediately, suppress them again, because the machinery of suppression is well practiced. The new feeling knocks at the door, and the old response answers it. This is not a sign that nothing changed. The fact that the feeling surfaced at all is significant. The fact that they touched, even briefly, something true about their own emotional life, that is the first step of a journey that for many avoidants only completes itself over years. You are probably wondering, in the quiet beneath all of this information, whether they feel it for you specifically, whether it's you that their nervous system holds at the center of all of this unprocessed feeling. And that question deserves an honest answer rather than a comforting one. The human beings who leave the deepest impressions on avoidance are typically those who were closest to breaking through. Not those who were loudest, not those who pushed hardest, but those who were genuine enough, consistent enough, patient enough, and perhaps threatening enough in the best possible way to get underneath the surface management and touch something real. If you were that person, you will have left a mark that doesn't fade in the way ordinary experiences fade, not because of anything mystical, because the brain encodes significance, and what the avoidant brain encodes most deeply is precisely what it tried hardest to suppress. There is a particular kind of memory that avoidants carry, not nostalgic exactly, and not simply sad. It's the memory of a feeling they didn't let themselves fully have, the meeting between what was offered and what they couldn't yet receive. These memories are, neurologically, unfinished business. The brain returns to unfinished things, repeatedly, at inconvenient times, and each return is another opportunity for the suppressed feeling to rise. It's worth understanding how the avoidance relationship with time differs from most people's, because it explains something that is often deeply baffling to those on the outside of this dynamic. For most people, emotions and their expression happen in relatively close proximity to each other. You feel something, and relatively quickly, that feeling moves toward expression, toward words, toward connection, toward some form of outward acknowledgement. The gap between feeling and expression might be hours, or a day, maybe a few days for particularly difficult emotions. For avoidance, that gap can be enormous. Months, sometimes longer. The feeling that was present in the relationship, the real, genuine feeling, might not surface into their conscious experience until long after the relationship has ended. Not because it wasn't there, but because the suppression was so effective that it genuinely took time to erode. This is deeply inconvenient for everyone involved, including the avoidant, because by the time they are finally in touch with what they felt, what they feel, the context has often changed dramatically. You may have moved on. You may have rebuilt your life in ways that no longer leave room for them. You may have healed from the confusion and the grief, to a point where reopening it would cost you more than it gave you. None of that cancels the validity of what they eventually reached, but it is a consequence of the delay, and it is, in some ways, the most poignant aspect of avoidant psychology. Not that they don't feel, but that they feel so consistently out of time. What you're navigating right now, the uncertainty, the trying to read meaning into distance, the cycling between anger and compassion, between wanting to reach out and knowing you shouldn't, is one of the most emotionally taxing positions a person can be in because it combines two of the most difficult human experiences simultaneously. The first is loss. The second is ambiguity. And ambiguity psychologically is often harder to metabolize than even clear, definitive loss. The mind can process what it knows. What it cannot process easily is a question that has no current answer. If you've been living in that ambiguity, the toll is real. It's not weakness that it hurts. It's not neediness that you still think about. The desire to understand, to make sense of someone whose behavior contradicted what you sensed they felt, that is a deeply human response to a genuinely confusing situation. What you're actually craving is not necessarily them back. What you're craving is coherence, the story that makes sense of what happened, the knowledge that what you felt between you was real, even if it wasn't enough to survive the weight of their defenses. That coherence is available to you, not through them, but through understanding. And the understanding is this: real attraction, real connection, real emotional significance. These things register in avoidance even when they cannot express them, even when they actively move away from them. The pull you felt was not imaginary. The moments of genuine closeness were not performance. The warmth was real, even when the retreat that followed it was equally real. The tragedy of avoidant attachment, because that is what it is, a genuine tragedy, not a character flaw, but a tragedy of timing and nervous system wiring, is that the feeling and the capacity to act on the feeling are not yet aligned. They may never fully align without significant work. And that work is theirs to do or not do, on their timeline, in their own interior. You cannot do it for them. You could not have done it for them. All of the patience, all of the love, all of the understanding you brought to this connection could not have accelerated a process that is fundamentally about their relationship with themselves. When an avoidant does finally confront their real feelings, fully, without immediately reburying them, the experience they report is often described in almost physical terms: a release, a dropping of something heavy, the sensation of having been at war with themselves for a very long time, and finally, tentatively, laying down the weapons. That moment of contact with their own emotional truth doesn't always look like what you might imagine. It doesn't always arrive with clarity or with the language of feeling. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, the exhaustion of maintaining distance, of managing every interaction to avoid genuine exposure, of running the constant background calculation of how close is too close and how much to show and what to keep hidden. The maintenance of emotional unavailability is genuinely physically draining. The nervous system expends significant resources keeping the suppression architecture operational. When it finally starts to fail, when the avoidance stops actively rebuilding the wall every time a feeling threatens it, what follows is sometimes simply stillness, a kind of unexpected quiet in a mind that has been at war with itself for so long. And in that stillness, the feelings that were always there become audible, not as noise, not as overwhelm, but as signal, clear, human, recognizable signal. This is grief. This is longing. This is the face of a specific person that I pushed away because I didn't know how to hold them close without being afraid. The question of whether they will act on those feelings, whether they will reach out, whether they will grow, whether the breakthrough translates into changed behavior, is genuinely unanswerable in any universal way. Some do. Some, having touched the feeling once, find it unbearable to lose again and begin the hard work of learning a different way to attach. Some find therapists, some have the breakthrough alone, and slowly, over subsequent relationships, become capable of more. And some retreat again, rebuild, go back to the managed, defended version of themselves, because the feeling, even when it was finally real, was too threatening to stay in. Not because you weren't worth it, not because the feeling wasn't genuine, but because the nervous system that learned to protect itself in childhood is not undone by a single moment of clarity. What you deserve, and this matters independently of what they do or don't do, is to stop waiting for them to have the breakthrough before you allow yourself to fully grieve. The grief of loving an avoidant is often delayed by the same quality that makes loving them so complicated. The sense that it isn't fully over yet, that there is something unresolved, that somewhere behind the distance there is a feeling that, if it ever surfaced, would change everything. Maybe it would. Maybe, one day, it does. Maybe they sit in a quiet room and the feeling rises and they recognize it and they are finally able to carry it towards you instead of away from you. But your life cannot be structured around the possibility of their eventual becoming. You are a whole emotional reality in your own right. Your capacity for love, your patience, your willingness to try to understand someone as complex and defended as they are, these are not weaknesses. They are evidence of a kind of emotional generosity that deserves to be met. Whether it is met by them or by someone else who is already in contact with their feelings for you, someone who doesn't need loss to know what they have, that remains to be written. But it will be written. And the understanding you've built through this experience, the depth of self-awareness that only comes from loving someone who made you examine everything you thought you knew about love, that is not wasted. It is, in its own painful way, the thing that will make you extraordinarily capable of recognizing the real thing when it finally arrives without a wall around it. The avoidant in your life, wherever they are right now, in whatever degree of distance or internal conflict, is not a mystery without a center. At the center is a person who learned to protect themselves so thoroughly